Try not to embarrass me tonight, Evie. These people operate on a level you can't even comprehend. Julian leaned in the scent of his premium Creed Aventus cologne, cloying in the crisp harbour air. I didn't say a word. I didn't tighten my grip on my clutch or roll my eyes. I just stepped off the mahogany water taxi and walked onto the private island beside him, my stiletto boots clicking against the stone pier. Less than 30 seconds later, Alistair Sterling, the multi-billionaire shipping tycoon Julian, was vibrating with desperation to impress. Cut himself off mid-sentence with the governor. He rushed past a line of waiting executives, shook my hand with both of his, and beamed Evelyn, "Thank God. We've all been sweating bullets waiting for you." My husband's face went pale so fast it was almost poetic. For 5 agonizing weeks, Julian had coached me on how not to ruin his career. Make sure you book an appointment at Oscar Blandy for that Friday he'd mandated over his morning avocado toast, speaking with the slow, deliberate cadence of a man explaining basic geometry to a toddler. Professional styling only Evie. None of that messy bun thing you do before your coffee. He said it like I was fundamentally incapable of basic human grooming. Buy a new gown, something from the current Dior line. Elegant, sophisticated, but don't go trying to look flashy. He'd instructed a week later, looking at my closet as if I didn't understand high society Manhattan dress codes. Just smile, hold your champagne, and let me handle the actual macroeconomic conversations he had. Reminded me the night before his tone dripping with patronizing sweetness. These wall titans can be judgmental about backgrounds. I just don't want you to feel out of your depth. I listened to every condescending directive. I nodded through every patronizing suggestion. I swallowed the urge to scream and let him believe with absolute intoxicating certainty that I needed his corporate guidance to navigate a room that was supposedly way above my level. Because the entire time he was drafting his little networking game plans, I was the one structural engineer on the eastern seaboard, saving the very island we were standing on. I had been directing the massive multi-million-dollar maritime restoration of the Sterling Heritage Port and its historic 19th-century granite fortress for over 14 grueling months. It was a project that had already secured me a National Preservation Medal and a feature on the cover of Engineering News Record. The entire time, Alistair Sterling was calling my personal cell 3 times a week for engineering updates, texting me photos of antique maritime salvage fixtures he'd found at European auctions, and asking if the structural load-bearing capacity of the restored ballroom could handle his grand piano. But Julian never asked about my day. He never bothered to learn what my firm actually did, never looked at the blueprints spread across the spare room, and never, not once, connected the dots. So when we walked into that vaulted stone foyer, and every single assumption he had built his ego on collapsed in seconds, I can't say I felt a single shred of remorse. My name is Evelyn Vance. I am 38 years old, and this is the story of how I let my husband underestimate my mind, my money, and my worth, and how it cost him absolutely everything. To understand how we got to that pier, you have to understand who I am when I am not wearing a $1,000 silk gown. I am a maritime structural engineer specializing in historic harbor preservation. It's a niche most people don't even know exists. I don't design cookie-cutter glass high-rises or suburban master-planned communities. I rescue historic, deep-water infrastructure that everyone else has written off as an environmental and financial lost cause. Century-old naval shipyards, retrofitted into billion-dollar luxury waterfronts. Abandoned iron frame lighthouses crumbling into the Atlantic. Historic granite seawalls with catastrophic subterranean erosion issues. I deal with failing foundation piles buried 60 feet beneath black seawater under restrictive federal historical designations, so suffocating that most commercial architects won't even submit a bid. That is my playground. The impossible high-stakes structural puzzles that require advanced hydraulic engineering, historical material knowledge, and the kind of relentless, unyielding grit that doesn't panic when a cofferdam starts leaking at 3 in the morning. Last year, my private consulting firm brought in $15 million in gross revenue. I have a National Heritage Engineering Award sitting on my mahogany office shelf in Tribeca, right next to a signed commendation from the Department of the Interior. 4 years ago, I gave the keynote address at the International Infrastructure Summit in Boston, where 300 male executives in bespoke suits sat in dead silence taking meticulous notes while I explained polymer injection strategies for stabilizing mid-century industrial peers. But you would never guess a single syllable of that resume if you ran into me on a Tuesday afternoon. I don't roll up to work in a town car. I show up to active marine construction sites wearing steel-toed Red Wing boots, rugged Carhartt work pants, and an oversized high-visibility jacket covered in sea salt and fine sand. My hair is almost always shoved into a chaotic claw clip, entirely surrendered to the mercy of coastal humidity. I drive a dented, mud-splattered Ford F-150 Raptor that is intensely practical with hydrographic sonars rolling around the floorboards and heavy structural blueprints perpetually rolled up in the back seat. I don't wear luxury jewelry or designer labels to my sites because luxury silk doesn't survive diesel fumes, concrete dust, and salt spray corrosion. My hands are calloused from handling coring samples, and I keep my nails short and unpolished because long acrylics are a safety liability. When you are climbing down rusted iron scaffolding to inspect a failing woodpile at low tide. To the casual observer, and most definitely to my husband, I looked like a woman who was still trying to climb her way up the career ladder, not the woman who owned the company that built the ladder in the first place. Julian was a mid-level portfolio manager at a hedge fund, polished, calculated, and entirely obsessed with the aesthetics of wealth. When we met, I thought his ambition was drive. I didn't realize it was a hollow craving for validation. He loved our house, a historic stone and timber coastal estate in Rhode Island that I had bought as a foreclosure and spent 2 years structurally stabilizing and restoring myself. He loved telling his wall colleagues about the magnificent estate we secured, though he conveniently omitted that my money bought it and my hands stripped the original cedar beams. As Julian's obsession with breaking into the upper echelon of New York's elite intensified over our marriage, he began to view me less as a partner and more as an aesthetic project that required careful management. If I tried to talk about a major breakthrough in underwater concrete setting, his eyes would glaze over and he'd offer a tight, indulgent smile before pivoting to his fund's quarterly returns. Then 5 weeks ago, the cream-colored envelope arrived. Heavy cardstock, 24-carat gold, with embossed lettering, an invitation to Alistair Sterling's private island for a closed-door dinner. 10 couples. Total asset value in the room unimaginable. Julian came home practically vibrating, holding the card like it was a holy relic. "This is it, Evie." He'd breathed his eyes wide with a manic corporate hunger. "Sterling is launching a $2 billion sovereign wealth fund. If I can make the right impression, I was thinking you could come with me as my date. But we need a plan. We need to manage how we present ourselves." "Of course," I had said softly, dropping a handful of chopped vegetables into a pan, letting him have his moment. I watched him open his laptop and immediately start a strategic spreadsheet of the guest list. I let him spend the next 5 weeks lecturing me. I let him think I was a social risk. I went to the salon I bought the Dior dress, and I put on the Tiffany necklace he bought to upgrade me. I smiled in the mirror because I knew a truth that was going to blow his carefully constructed reality into pieces. In less than 2 hours, Julian was going to walk into a $500 million maritime paradise that existed solely because of my brain. He was preparing to network with titans who already knew my name for a dinner where I wasn't his +1, he was mine. To understand how my husband fell so completely into his own trap, you have to understand the jarring duality of my life. Julian lived in a world of pure abstraction, derivatives, algorithmic trading, and projected yields. My world was brutally, unyieldingly concrete. I was 38, see, and while Julian spent his days staring at green and red tickers on a Bloomberg terminal in a temperature-controlled midtown office, I spent mine battling the Atlantic Ocean to keep history from sliding into a watery grave. Maritime structural engineering is not a profession for the faint of heart, nor is it a career path that leaves room for vanity. My firm, Vance Maritime and Heritage Engineering, had become the premier agency for high-stakes coastal restoration on the eastern seaboard. We didn't build luxury condos or trendy glass pavilions. We stepped in when historical designations met catastrophic infrastructural failure. My specialty was salvaging structures that local municipalities and corporate developers had already stamped as structural losses. We took century-old granite dry docks covered in oyster shells, failing iron frame lighthouses battered by nor'easters, and massive decaying timber-piled piers, transforming them into fortified multi-million-dollar waterfront cultural districts. It was a brutal, beautiful science that required an intimate understanding of historical material chemistry, wave hydrodynamics, and subsurface geotechnics. Last year alone, my firm brought in $15 million in gross revenue. Our radical stabilization of the Brooklyn Navy Yard's historic dry dock had earned us a rare double feature on the cover of Engineering News record, the holy grail of the infrastructure world. On my mahogany office shelf in Tribeca, right next to my drafting station, sat a National Heritage Engineering Medal, awarded directly by the Department of the Interior. 4 years ago, I stood on a stage in Boston as the keynote speaker for the International Infrastructure Summit. 300 executives, almost entirely men in bespoke charcoal suits, sat in absolute pin-drop silence for 90 minutes, taking frantic notes while I explained polymer injection strategies for stabilizing mid-century industrial foundations beneath the water table. But you would never guess a single syllable of that corporate pedigree if you ran into me on any given Tuesday afternoon. I didn't roll up to my project sites in a chauffeured black town car like Julian's fund managers. I showed up at 5:30 a.m., driving a dented, mud-splattered Ford F-150 Raptor. The truck was a rolling disaster of pure utility. The floorboards were permanently caked with dried mud and salt crust. A hydrographic sonar rig was buckled into the passenger seat, and thousands of pages of structural blueprints were perpetually rolled up in the back seat. My daily uniform consisted of heavy, reinforced Carhartt work pants, steel-toed Red Wing boots covered in machine grease, and an oversized, high-visibility jacket that smelled faintly of diesel fumes and sea spray. My hair was never blown out. It was shoved ruthlessly into a chaotic plastic claw clip, entirely surrendered to the mercy of coastal humidity and wind. I kept my fingernails clipped short and completely unpolished, because long, manicured nails are a legitimate safety hazard when you are climbing down a rusted iron scaffolding at low tide to inspect a failing woodpile. My hands were calloused from handling concrete coring samples, and my skin bore the faint, permanent freckles of a woman who spent 10 hours a day under the harsh sun of open harbour barges. To the casual observer, to the union contractors on my sites, and most catastrophically to my own husband, I looked like a woman who was still struggling to climb her way up the construction ladder. I looked like a field supervisor or a secondary site inspector, not the sole owner of the multi-million-dollar engineering enterprise that had hired them all in the first place. Julian's brain simply could not reconcile my physical reality with his definition of success. In his highly transactional world, power was signaled by the precision of a suit tailoring the brand of a wristwatch and the exclusivity of a zip code. Because I chose to spend my capital on high-end underwater surveying drones and top-tier engineering talent, rather than designer handbags and charity gala tickets, he genuinely believed my career was a modest, exhausting little endeavor. He viewed my work as a respectable but ultimately unglamorous boutique drafting job, a gritty, blue-collar necessity that kept me busy while he focused on the real work of conquering Street Wall. And for 3 years I let him keep that comforting, condescending illusion completely intact. Julian and I met 4 years ago at a high-end charity dinner in the Hamptons. He was a newly promoted portfolio manager at a mid-tier hedge fund, looking devastatingly handsome, in a perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit and a vintage Rolex Submariner that caught the candlelight whenever he gestured. He possessed that effortless, polished confidence that usually belongs to men who have never had a single door closed in their faces. When he asked about my career over cocktails, I kept it brief, telling him I was finishing up a stabilization project on a historic naval pier. He smiled warmly, asked a few superficial follow-up questions, and laughed at my sanitized stories about finding Prohibition-era crates hidden beneath decaying floorboards. Looking back, I realize he wasn't fascinated by my expertise. He was charmed by the novelty of a beautiful woman who could talk about construction tools. Within 9 months, Julian moved into my home. It was a massive, historic stone and timber coastal estate, tucked away on a private cliffside in Rhode Island. I had bought the property as a crumbling foreclosure 5 years prior, long before I met him, and had spent 2 years structurally stabilizing the cliff face and completely restoring the structural integrity of the estate with my own hands. Julian absolutely loved that house. He spent hours bragging to his street wall colleagues about the magnificent coastal asset we managed to secure, though he always conveniently framed it as a joint financial triumph, entirely omitting the fact that my money had purchased it, and my calloused hands had stripped the original cedar beams. At first, our marriage felt balanced. But as Julian's obsession with breaking into the inner circle of New York's financial elite intensified, the dynamic shifted. Our dinner conversations became entirely one-sided. I would sit for an hour, listening to him dissect the internal politics of his fund, the complex leverage structures he was building, and the billionaire clients he was desperately courting. I asked intelligent questions, offered steady, emotional support, and celebrated his wins. But whenever the conversation shifted toward my world, his attention vanished. If I tried to share my excitement over a breakthrough in underwater concrete setting or tracking down a rare supplier of period-accurate structural iron, his eyes would immediately glaze over. He would offer a tight, indulgent, patronizing smile. The exact kind of smile a parent gives a toddler showing off a crayon drawing on the refrigerator. "That's nice, honey," he would say softly before immediately checking his phone for the late market futures. Then came the subtle, systemic campaign to reshape me into his ideal image of a corporate wife. The comments started small, masked as helpful advice. "Maybe wear heels instead of those flats for dinner tonight, Evie," he would suggest casually. "Have you thought about a different hairstyle? That messy clip look makes you look so tired." A week later it would be, "That dress is fine, but if you wore something with a recognizable logo, it would make a much better impression on my managing partner." He began to actively resent the time I dedicated to my firm. "You work too much," he barked one Sunday morning when he found me analyzing structural load blueprints at the kitchen table. "Can't your assistant handle this stuff? You shouldn't be ruining your weekends for a basic construction site." The condescension reached a fever pitch the evening I came home completely exhausted after a grueling 14-hour day, having personally managed an emergency collapse of a temporary cofferdam. I sat at the kitchen island, my shoulders aching when Julian walked in, looked at my salt-stained clothes and sighed with deep disappointment. "I know your little historical projects are important to you, Evie," he said, pouring himself a glass of scotch without offering me one. "But eventually you have to start thinking about our actual future together. You can't keep showing up to important social circles looking like you just left a shipyard. It's a liability for my advancement." He introduced me at his fund's cocktail mixers as my wife Evie. She does some design work for older properties. Followed quickly by a forced laugh to steer the conversation back to his market predictions. He never attended my industry galas, never came to see the magnificent waterfronts I had saved from destruction, and never bothered to read the articles profiling my company. He had completely detached my identity from my achievements. reducing his brilliant, self-made wife to a social placeholder who needed to be managed, polished, and kept quiet. He was completely blind to the reality of the woman sitting across from him, entirely unaware that the fuse to his perfect, arrogant world had already been lit. Julian's systemic dismissal of my career wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, calculated erosion. It was the death of 1,000 cuts, disguised as marital concern and corporate wisdom. After that grueling night with the collapsing cofferdam, his patronizing behavior solidified into a daily routine. He had officially filed my life's work away under the category of an eccentric little hobby, an inconvenient distraction from the main event, his glorious ascent up the street wall hierarchy. Every interaction we had became an exercise in damage control, with Julian positioning himself as the brilliant, benevolent director of my public image. I began to watch him with a detached, almost scientific curiosity. I wanted to see exactly how deep his delusion ran. Whenever my firm hit a major milestone, Julian would actively block it out. I remember coming home on a Thursday afternoon glowing with adrenaline because Vance Maritime had just finalized a 7-figure contract to restore a historic iron pier in Manhattan. I poured 2 glasses of wine, sat down across from him in our living room and told him the news. Julian didn't even look up from his iPad. He just gave a distracted nod, muttered, "That's great, babe, congrats," and immediately launched into a 20-minute rant about how his fund's managing partner hadn't CC'd him on an email regarding a new tech acquisition. The wine in my glass went warm, and I never brought up the contract again. The social erasure was even worse. At his firm's quarterly cocktail mixers, Julian developed a flawless routine for neutralizing my presence. He would grip my waist, pull me toward a circle of senior portfolio managers, and introduce me with a tight plastic smile that never reached his eyes. "This is my wife, Evie. She does some design and drafting work for older waterfront properties." He'd say, his voice laced with an apologetic undertone, as if he were asking them to excuse my blue-collar proximity. Before anyone could ask a follow-up question, Julian would smoothly cut in. "Speaking of infrastructure, did you guys see the latest Bloomberg report on the logistics sector? Our fund is heavily shorting the traditional carriers." He would seamlessly pivot the entire conversation back to his own territory, leaving me standing there like a decorative houseplant. I watched him check his Apple Watch whenever I did happen to speak to his colleagues. If a senior partner's wife asked me about my day, and I mentioned that I was tracking down a specific type of reclaimed 19th century timber, Julian would visibly stiffen. He would clear his throat, step into my space, and laugh, forced. "Evie gets so caught up in the technical weeds," he'd chuckle, patting my arm condescendingly. "Anyway, darling, shouldn't we go grab another drink before the catering closes?" He was terrified that my actual gritty reality would bleed through the polished veneer he had manufactured for me. He completely refused to participate in my world. When I was nominated for the National Heritage Engineering Medal, an incredibly prestigious honor in my field, for the elegant embossed invitation on the kitchen island, Julian used it as a coaster for his morning espresso for 3 days straight without ever reading it. When I finally asked him if he would fly down to Washington, D.C. with me for the ceremony, he sighed dramatically, rubbing his temples as if I were asking him to perform manual labor. "Evie, I'm in the middle of a critical capital raise for the new fund," he said, his tone dripping with exasperation. "I really don't have the bandwidth to take 2 days off for an industry dinner. Can't your project managers go with you?" I went alone. I stood on that stage in Washington, accepted the medal from the Department of the Interior, and looked out at a room of 300 people applauding my brain. When I returned to Rhode Island the next day, the medal stayed in my leather briefcase. Julian never asked to see it. He never asked how the trip went. He was too busy rehearsing a pitch for a billionaire family office, entirely blind to the fact that his own wife was operating at a level of institutional prestige he could only dream of achieving. He had reduced a $15 million CEO to a social liability that required constant defensive management. The turning point arrived 6 weeks ago, wrapped in an envelope that practically radiated institutional wealth. Julian came home that evening in a state of manic euphoria, his eyes wide and his chest puffed out like a man who had just conquered a kingdom. He didn't even take off his Tom Ford coat before he marched into the kitchen, holding a heavy, cream-colored envelope with 24-carat gold embossed lettering. He placed it on the marble island with the reverence of a priest handling a holy relic. "Alistair Sterling is hosting a private closed-door dinner," Julian whispered, his voice trembling slightly with corporate reverence. "At the Sterling Heritage Port Estate, black tie. Only 10 couples on the entire eastern seaboard were invited, Evie. Just 10. I kept my back to him, methodically slicing vegetables for dinner, letting the quiet irony of the moment wash over me. "Wow," I said softly, keeping my tone perfectly neutral, matching the submissive housewife persona he had assigned to me. "That sounds like a massive deal." "A massive deal, Evie, you don't understand," Julian said, pacing around the kitchen island, his hands gesturing wildly. "Alistair Sterling controls the largest maritime logistics and green energy portfolio in the country. He's currently launching a $2 billion sovereign wealth fund. If I can get into his inner circle, if I can make the right impression, my promotion to senior partner isn't just guaranteed. I'll be running the entire division within 12 months. He stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes narrowing with a sudden tense mixture of ambition and deep-seated anxiety. "I was thinking, you could come with me as my date." The phrasing was a masterclass in psychological condescension. It wasn't, "I want you there by my side," or "Will you come celebrate this milestone with me?" It was, "I was thinking you could come with me as my date." He was extending a conditional invitation, treating the event like an elite club I wasn't qualified to enter, but one he was generously willing to smuggle me into out of marital obligation. "Of course, Julian," I said, turning around and offering him a placid, supportive smile. "When is it?" "5 weeks from Saturday," he replied, taking a deep breath to steady his racing heart. 5 weeks. That gives us plenty of time to prepare. He didn't mean preparing his financial pitches. He meant preparing me. The intensive coaching began the very next morning over breakfast, transitioning from subtle suggestions into rigid, daily operational directives. Julian became an absolute dictator regarding my appearance, my speech, and my behavior. By the end of the first week, he had constructed an entire strategic playbook for how I was allowed to present myself to the billionaires of New York. "I already made an appointment for you at Oscar Blandy in Manhattan for that Friday morning," he announced over his espresso, his voice commanding and completely devoid of room for negotiation. "Full styling, blow out the works. None of that chaotic claw-clip messy bun thing you usually do for your project sites, Evie. These people notice details. First impressions are everything in Sterling's circle." I took a slow sip of my coffee, looking at him across the marble counter. "My hair is perfectly fine, Julian." "For a maritime yard, sure," he fired back, offering that familiar, patronizing smile. "But this is Alistair Sterling's private island. These are ultra-high net worth individuals. You need to look polished, not like you just stepped off an offshore barge." A few days later, the wardrobe directives arrived. He sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open to high-end luxury catalogs. "We need to get you a new gown," he instructed, pointing at the screen. "Something from the current Dior or Chanel line. Elegant, sophisticated classic, but nothing too flashy. It needs to have a recognizable silhouette, something that signals you understand luxury without screaming for attention. I don't want you looking like you bought your dress off the rack at Nordstrom." I looked at the screen, then back at my husband. "I have plenty of beautiful gowns in my closet, Julian. Dresses I wore to major galas." "Evie." "Those were local engineering benefits," he said dismissively, waving his hand as if my achievements were a joke. "This is street wall royalty. Trust me on this. I know how these circles work. You want to look like you belong in the room, don't you? I nodded slowly, keeping my face completely blank. If you think it's necessary, Julian, I'll buy the dress. Good, he said, relaxing back into his chair, looking immensely satisfied with himself, completely unaware that he was carefully dressing me up for my own coronation. He truly believed he was saving me from my own unsophisticated nature, entirely blind to the fact that the man hosting the dinner had my personal cell number saved under emergency structural directive in his phone. I let him draft his spreadsheets, I let him dictate my wardrobe, and I wrapped myself in the quiet, lethal armor of his absolute ignorance. The morning after Julian received that cream-colored invitation, our kitchen was transformed into a corporate war room. I walked downstairs at 6 a.m. to find my husband embedded at the marble island, his MacBook Pro open a moleskin notebook beside him, and a double shot of espresso sweating onto the stone. He was deep into a digital stakeout, building comprehensive dossiers on every single couple on Alistair Sterling's highly classified guest list. He had somehow leveraged a contact within the event's high-end catering firm to secure the names of the 10 invited couples, and he was treating the data like an NSA operative prepping for a foreign infiltration. Michael Vance, no relation founder of Vance Global Alpha, Julian muttered to himself, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he pulled up SEC filings and past philanthropic press releases. Net worth estimated at $1.8 billion, heavily invested in the Atlantic offshore wind expansion 3 years ago. So he stopped, looked up at me with wild, bloodshot eyes, and tapped his pen against his chin. I need to find a way to casually mention that our fund has been modeling maritime infrastructure logistics. I need to make it sound completely organic, like it just slipped out over the first course. I walked over to the Mealer machine, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and watched the performance. This was Julian in his absolute element, strategizing positioning and calculating exactly how to morph his personality to extract maximum value from a room. He had always been an aggressive networker, viewing every human interaction not as a relationship, but as a transaction with a clear liquidity event. But what made my blood run cold wasn't his desperate ambition to impress Alistair Sterling. It was the fact that his strategic preparation completely extended to the clinical containment of his own wife. You should probably avoid talking about any of your local peer projects if it comes up during the cocktail hour, he said, not even looking up from his spreadsheet as I took a seat across from him. These people operate in global macros. They aren't going to understand the difference between a boutique heritage engineer and a basic commercial contractor. If someone asks what you do, just keep it incredibly vague. Tell them you manage a niche architectural consultancy in Tribeca, and then smoothly hand the conversation off to me. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, keeping my eyes fixed on him. Just tell them I'm an architect and pivot. Exactly, Julian said, finally looking up and flashing a brief, patronizing smile. Confidence, Evie, but a quiet background confidence. Successful people don't want to hear about construction struggles, structural defects, or union disputes. They want to hear about massive capital wins. Just let me drive the narrative, okay? It's safer for both of us. Over the next 4 weeks, Julian's obsession with the dinner escalated into a full-blown manic episode. He spent nearly $10,000 on a bespoke charcoal tuxedo from a Savile Row tailor's traveling representative in Manhattan. I would walk past the master bathroom in the evenings and hear him rehearsing his pitch to the mirror, testing out different inflections for his voice, trying to strike the perfect chord of elite Wall Street arrogance, masked as casual brilliance. He also became completely fixated on my physical transformation. He checked in daily to ensure I hadn't cancelled the appointment at Oscar Blandy. When the weekend for wardrobe shopping arrived, he practically marched me down to Fifth Avenue. I went into the Dior boutique, bypassed the flashy seasonal pieces, and selected a structured floor-length black silk gown. It was a masterpiece of understated American elegance, the kind of dress that didn't yell for attention from across a room, but completely commanded the space once you noticed it. When I tried it on for him at home, Julian nodded with a patronizing sigh of relief, as if he had successfully housebroken a wild animal. "Perfect," he murmured, adjusting my collar. "Exactly right. You actually look like a partner's wife." Every single instruction Julian delivered over those 5 weeks landed like a small, compounding weight in my chest. This was my husband, the man who had stood across from me in a historic chapel and sworn to honor, cherish, and respect my mind. Yet when the stakes were high enough, he didn't see a brilliant, self-made multi-millionaire CEO. He saw a liability. He saw a blue-collar girl from Rhode Island who might accidentally get mud on his pristine corporate ladder. I didn't push back. I didn't defend my $15 million revenue or my national medal. I just absorbed his condescension with a terrifying, absolute calm. I wanted to see exactly how far his arrogance would carry him before the floor dropped out from beneath his feet. Because while Julian was memorizing Alistair Sterling's Wikipedia page, I was the one actively managing Sterling's single largest private asset. The Sterling Heritage Port Estate wasn't just a luxury venue. It was a sprawling, historic 19th-century naval fortress and deep-water harbour complex that Alistair Sterling had purchased to serve as the crown jewel of his family's global legacy. It was a $500 million restoration nightmare. When Sterling bought it, the entire underwater granite foundations was sliding into the Atlantic due to decades of tidal erosion and catastrophic subsurface subsidence. 3 international commercial firms had walked away, claiming the structural preservation parameters set by New York State were physically impossible to meet. Then Alistair Sterling called Vance maritime. For 14 grueling months, I had been the absolute dictator of that island. I had engineered a radical proprietary polymer injection system to stabilize the 60-foot timber piles deep beneath the black seawater. I had managed a team of 80 union commercial divers, navigated brutal federal environmental restrictions, and painstakingly reconstructed the historic stone seawall. Alistair and I had spent hundreds of hours together in the trenches. We had sat in his Manhattan penthouse, debating structural load capacities, walked the windy island piers at midnight during critical concrete pours, and texted each other constantly about historical architectural details. He had my personal cell phone number saved under EV structural command with a priority breakthrough bypass. Just that Tuesday morning, while Julian was screaming at an intern over Zoom about a spreadsheet formatting error, my phone blew up with a text from Alistair. It was a photo of a pair of massive restored 1880s bronze maritime lanterns he had tracked down at a salvage auction in London. Evie found these for the harbour gate entrance. "Will the original iron anchors support the torque in a high wind? Let me know so I can wire the funds." The text read. I replied within 2 minutes with the exact wind load formulas. Julian had absolutely no idea. I had mentioned the Sterling Port project to him exactly twice over the last year. The first time was when my firm beat out the multinational conglomerates to land the contract. I had come home, poured us drinks, and told him I had just secured the biggest maritime heritage restoration project New York had seen in a decade. Julian had looked up from his phone for 3 seconds, said, "Wow, that's huge, babe, proud of you," and immediately went back to checking his fund's short positions. The second time was 6 months ago, when I told him I would be living on a barge off Long Island for 10 days straight to oversee a high-stakes, high-risk underwater foundation stabilization. "Okay, fine. Just make sure you're back by the 15th, he had snapped, completely annoyed. "We have that dinner with my managing director and I can't show up alone." He never asked for the client's full name. He never asked about the scope. In his mind, my work existed in a completely separate, inferior ecosystem that had nothing to do with the real world of high finance. He was about to find out exactly how wrong he was. The night of the dinner arrived with a bitter, salt-tinged wind sweeping across the Atlantic. I sat silently in the passenger seat of the sleek black town car Julian had hired for the evening, watching the Manhattan skyline fade into a blur of neon needles through the tinted glass. Julian was vibrating with an intense nervous energy next to me. He had spent the entire afternoon adjusting his tuxedo in front of our mirror, obsessing over the precise fold of his silk pocket square and the exact shine on his patent leather Oxfords. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his thumbs nervously rubbing against each other as he mentally ran through his financial pitches for the 100th time. "Remember the seating chart I mapped out, Evie?" he said, his voice dropping to a tense, low whisper as the town car pulled up to the secured marina at the edge of the harbour. "If they seat us apart, do not panic. Just stick to the script. If Mrs. Sterling asks you about your hobbies, talk about your volunteer work or the Historical Preservation Society. Do not bring up the offshore drilling platforms. Do not bring up the union crane operators. And for the love of God, don't mention that you spent last weekend on a concrete barge in a high-visibility jacket." I turned my head slowly, looking at my husband through the dim interior light of the vehicle. My hair was perfectly coiffed, sprayed into submission by the elite team at Oscar Blandy. The Dior gown clung to my frame with flawless architectural precision, and the Tiffany diamond necklace Julian had bought to upgrade my appearance caught the passing headlights. To him, I was a perfectly packaged corporate asset, a silent partner whose only job was to look elegant and stay out of the way of his ambition. "I remember the script, Julian," I said, my voice smooth, cold, and entirely devoid of emotion. "Good," he breathed, straightening his bow tie as the driver opened his door. "This is our one shot, Evie. Let's make it flawless." We stepped out into the crisp, sharp night air. The water taxi waiting at the pier wasn't a standard commuter vessel. It was a custom-built 30-foot mahogany commuter boat, a flawless replica of a 1920s rum runner with twin roaring inboard engines that smelled of high-octane fuel and polished lacquer. Julian practically skipped down the gangway, his eyes wide as he took in the sheer opulence of the transport. He handed me onto the boat with a theatrical flourish, making sure the two captains noticed the pristine tailoring of his tuxedo. As the boat shoved off, cutting through the choppy black water of the harbour toward Alistair Sterling's private island, Julian leaned in close to my ear. The heavy, sweet scent of his Creed Aventus cologne filled the small space between us. He looked at the looming outline of the island fortress in the distance, the massive stone walls illuminated by powerful floodlights, the restored historic harbour gates standing proud against the crashing waves. He leaned in closer, his breath hot against my cheek, and delivered the final punchline to his 5 weeks of arrogance. "Try not to embarrass me tonight, Evie. These people operate on a level you can't even comprehend." I didn't say a single word. I didn't tighten my grip on my clutch, and I didn't roll my eyes. I just stared ahead at the massive granite seawall loom, larger and larger in the darkness. I stared at the precise reinforced polymer-injected joints at the base of the pier, the exact joints I had spent 3 months designing and executing to keep this entire private paradise from sliding into the abyss. I walked up the mahogany plank beside him, the heels of my stiletto boots clicking rhythmically against the stone pier, stepping directly into the trap he had so meticulously built for himself. We had barely crossed the threshold of the pier when the carefully constructed illusion of Julian's reality shattered into a million pieces. Less than 30 seconds into our arrival, Alistair Sterling himself, the multi-billionaire shipping tycoon, a man who normally required 3 levels of executive screening, just to schedule a 5-minute phone call, abruptly cut himself off mid-sentence with the governor of New York. He turned his back on a line of waiting hedge fund managers and real estate moguls, his eyes locking onto us as we approached the vaulted stone foyer. He didn't just walk over. He practically rushed past the security detail. He stepped right past Julian, who had already plastered a practiced sycophantic smile across his face and extended a hand for a formal corporate greeting. Alistair ignored Julian's hand entirely. Instead, he reached out, caught my hand with both of his, and beamed with a look of profound, genuine relief. "Evelyn." "Thank God," Alistair said, his voice booming through the stone entryway, carrying easily to every single high-net-worth individual in the room. "We've all been sweating absolute bullets waiting for you." The catering team was trying to tell me the historic ballroom vault couldn't handle the structural vibration of the grand piano I had flown in from Vienna. I told them they were idiots, but I needed my absolute boss of an engineer to confirm the load-bearing capacity before I let the pianist sit down. My husband's face went pale so fast it was almost poetic. The practiced, arrogant smile froze on his lips, his hand still hanging awkwardly in mid-air between Alistair and me. The blood drained from his cheeks until his skin matched the cream-coloured cardstock of the invitation he had worshipped for 5 weeks. "Alistair!" I said, my voice completely steady, a sharp contrast to the suffocating silence that had just fallen over Julian. "The vault is reinforced with dual-layer carbon fibre wrap and high-strength epoxy grout. You could drive a commercial semi-truck onto that ballroom floor, and it wouldn't deflect a millimetre. Tell your catering team to stop panicking and play the music." Alistair let out a roaring laugh, clapping me on the shoulder with deep familiarity. "See, this is why I pay you the absurd consulting fees, Evie. Absolute certainty." He finally paused, his eyes shifting down to the frozen statuesque figure of my husband standing beside me. Alistair blinked, as if just noticing a piece of decorative furniture. "And who is this gentleman with you, darling? Your security detail?" I turned my head slightly, looking at Julian. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes wide and completely vacant, staring at Alistair, then at me, then down at the stone floor he had just lectured me about. The entire universe he had built, the world where he was the brilliant portfolio manager guiding his unpolished wife through the upper echelons of society, had just collapsed beneath his feet. "Alistair, this is Julian," I said smoothly, a cold, dangerous smile touching the corners of my lips. "My husband. He works in finance. A mid-level portfolio manager, I believe. He was incredibly eager to meet you tonight to discuss your new sovereign wealth fund." Julian tried to speak, but his throat seemed to have completely seized up. He let out a small, strangled, choking sound before managing a weak, reedy whisper. "Mr. Sterling, an honour." Alistair didn't even offer his hand. He just gave Julian a brief, sharp, transactional nod, the exact kind of dismissive, polite glance Julian usually reserved for the valets who parked his car. "Finance, right. Wonderful. Well, Evelyn, come with me. The governor and Michael Vance have been dying to ask you about the structural feasibility of the new deep-water turbine foundations for the offshore wind project. We've got a seat reserved for you right at the head of the table." As Alistair steered me into the grand ballroom, Julian followed 2 steps behind us, his boots dragging against the stone, looking like a ghost haunting his own corporate funeral. He wasn't the driver of the narrative anymore. He was just a +1 dragged into a room where my name was law, and his credentials didn't even warrant a handshake. The grand ballroom of the Sterling Heritage Port Fortress was a masterclass in architectural opulence, a space where raw industrial history collided with unimaginable wealth. Massive hand-hewn cedar beams stretched across a ceiling vaulted 3 stories high, braced by original 19th-century wrought-iron ties that I had spent 3 weeks retrofitting with high-tensile carbon steel. The walls were thick, exposed grey granite, weeping with the faint, cold moisture of the Atlantic Ocean just outside, but warmed tonight by the amber glow of hundreds of beeswax candles. A massive 40-foot-long table, crafted from a single slab of reclaimed shipwreck oak, dominated the center of the room, glittering with baccarat crystal antique sterling silver and heavy cream floral arrangements. As Alistair Sterling guided me toward the head of the table, The ambient chatter of America's financial and political elite died down to a respectful murmur. These were people who controlled global markets, dictated national infrastructure policies, and moved billions of dollars with a single text message. Yet as I walked into the room in my structured Dior gown, the focus shifted entirely. They didn't see a decorative spouse. They saw the literal foundation upon which this entire luxury empire was built. Alistair pulled out the heavy, leather-carved chair immediately to his right, the absolute seat of honor positioned directly opposite the governor of New York. "Sit, Evelyn, please," Alistair insisted, his voice booming with casual authority. He then gestured vaguely toward the opposite end of the long oak table, where the low-ranking associates and distant corporate extensions were being systematically corralled. "And Julian, my boy, I think we have a spot for you down by the catering station next to young Miller from the logistics firm. You two finance guys can talk shop down there." Julian's face didn't just go pale this time. It turned a hollow, translucent shade of grey. He stood frozen in the middle of the aisle, his hands twitching at his sides, looking desperately down the length of the table. The seating chart he had meticulously mapped out on his spreadsheet at home was completely worthless. He had placed himself next to Sterling and me near the center, projecting an aura of equal partnership. Instead, he was being exiled to the corporate Siberia of the table miles away from the center of power, while his unpolished wife was enshrined at the right hand of the host. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a panicked, silent plea for help. He wanted me to speak up. He wanted me to say, "Oh, Alistair, actually, I'd love for my brilliant husband to sit next to me." He wanted me to use my immense social capital to rescue his fragile, collapsing ego. I didn't offer him a lifeline. I didn't even look him in the eye. I simply smoothed the black silk of my gown, sat down in the leather chair, and nodded gracefully to the governor. "Thank you, Alistair. The ballroom looks spectacular. The structural vibration dampers are working flawlessly, I see. Not a single ripple in the champagne glasses." "Flawlessly, Evie, absolutely flawlessly." Alistair beamed, ignoring the ghost of my husband entirely as Julian slowly, humiliatingly dragged his feet down to the far end of the table, slinking into his designated seat like a scolded child. Within minutes, the first course, a delicate truffled sea scallop carpaccio, was served. But nobody at the head of the table was looking at the food. Michael Vance, the billionaire founder of Vance Global Alpha, whom Julian had spent weeks researching, leaned across the table, his sharp eyes locking onto me. "Evelyn," Michael said, his tone dripping with intense professional respect. "Alistair tells me your firm just finalized the proprietary engineering models for deep water turbine foundations. We are looking at a $3 billion offshore wind expansion off the coast of Montauk, and the state environmental restrictions regarding subterranean seismic disruption are killing our margins. Every commercial outfit I talk to says we have to halt drilling during the migratory whale seasons. Tell me you have a structural workaround." I picked up my silver fork, completely commanding the space. "I do, Michael," I said, my voice carrying cleanly over the soft classical music echoing from the Viennese grand piano. "The issue isn't the drilling itself, it's the acoustic resonance traveling through the granite shelf. Vance Maritime developed a localized high-density polymer shroud that wraps the hydraulic hammer assemblies. We tested it in Rhode Island last month. It dampens subsurface acoustic output by 82%, keeping you well below the federal threshold. You can drill 34 weeks a year, completely bypassing the seasonal moratorium." Michael Vance stared at me for 3 seconds in dead silence before a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He reached into his tuxedo jacket, pulled out a heavy matte black business card, and slid it across the oak table. "Call my personal assistant on Monday morning, Evelyn. I don't care what your current retainer is, I'll double it. We need Vance Maritime on this project before the Q3 filings." I'll have my managing director send over our standard vetting contract. I replied smoothly, sliding the black card into my clutch without a hint of hesitation. From the far end of the table, through the glittering forest of crystal wine glasses, I could feel Julian's eyes burning into me. He was sitting in absolute silence, completely isolated. The young logistics associate next to him was deep in conversation with someone else, leaving Julian to watch his wife command a $3 billion industrial negotiation over a plate of seafood. He watched the governor nod in rapt agreement as I outlined federal regulatory loopholes. He watched global titans write down my words as if they were gospel. Every single patronizing lecture he had delivered over his morning avocado toast. Just smile, hold your champagne. Let me handle the macroeconomics was currently suffocating him. He was realizing with absolute agonizing clarity that he wasn't the strategist managing a liability. He was a parasitic passenger on a ship he didn't know how to sail, and the captain had just cut the tether. As Alistair raised his glass to toast the success of the Sterling Heritage Port, he looked directly at me. "To Evelyn Vance," the billionaire announced, lifting his crystal flute high. "The brilliant mind that keeps this island above water." The entire table rose voices echoing in unison, "To Evelyn." Down at the very end of the table, Julian slowly raised his glass, his hand trembling so violently that the champagne spilled over his knuckles, washing over.